Good morning, everybody, and thank you for being here. We will proceed to our event without further ado. My name is Carson Holloway. I'm the chair of the Department of Political Science. I'm also the director of the Constitutional Studies Forum, which is the sponsor for this event. I should mention as well that we're grateful to the support of the Jack Miller Center, which provided the funding for the lecture series of which this event is a part. Our event today is on Pope Benedict on the moral foundations of politics, and we arranged it because we thought it would be nice to have some serious reflections on his thought in the wake of his passing. So we're going to have a public lecture by a very distinguished scholar, and then a panel discussion by another distinguished scholar, and then also me. So it's mainly distinguished, but not exclusively distinguished. So let me begin by introducing our speakers, and then I'll turn it over to Dr. Reno, who will deliver the main address. And then we'll have some panel discussion afterwards, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. I will also mention one last time, and then you won't hear it from me about this anymore. If you parked in the Thompson lot and you need a parking pass and the speaker is going on, you could just kind of come over and get one from me, and I'll be happy to give you one. So our lecturer today is R.R. Reno, who has served as editor of First Things, an important magazine and journal in religion and public life, since 2011. He received his PhD in theology from Yale University and taught theology and ethics at Creighton University in Omaha, Nebraska, for 20 years. He's published in many academic journals, and his opinion essays have appeared in Commentary, National Review, The Wall Street Journal, The Washington Post, and The New York Times, and other popular outlets. His most recent books include The End of Interpretation, The Return of the Strong Gods, Resurrecting the Idea of Christian Society, Fighting the Noonday Devil, Sanctified Vision, and a commentary on the book of Genesis. So we'll hear from Dr. Reno in just a moment, but I also want to introduce Deacon Omar F.A. Gutierrez, who is seated next to him on the panel, who is the president and co-founder of the Evangelium Institute, as well as the director for the propagation of the faith in the Archdiocese of Omaha. With an academic background in Catholic theology, he has many years of teaching and ministry experience in the church. He is recognized as an expert on Catholic social teaching and has several works in print, online, and in podcast form on that subject. So let's welcome both of our speakers, and I'll turn it over to Dr. Reno.
Thanks, Carson, for that introduction. It's great to be in Omaha. This is a rescheduled lecture. I was here in February to give this talk, and we had a wonderful snowstorm, and so I got a snow day and was able to spend the day with my friends and go sledding with their kids, and it was and I'm back, and I'm happy to be back, especially the redbuds in their full splendor. My wife and I lived in Omaha for over 20 years, and we have nothing but fond memories, and it's great to see old friends here in the audience. Carson also said that I was a scholar. That is not true. One of my grad students' friends said, "Oh, Rusty," after I took the job at First Things, "this is great. You were never a scholar." So I think I would like to think I'm a reasonably well-educated journalist. And so it's in that spirit that I want to talk about Pope Benedict's work in the context of an imperative that I think is before us. And that imperative is to restore a culture of freedom in our own context. Now, I want to begin with an assertion to this group, and that is that Americans care about freedom first and foremost. I have some arguments with my Catholic integralist friends on this score. I do think that it's for Americans, the F word is the leading word, the freedom word. Now, we're concerned about justice, of course, and we're not indifferent to the common good. But these and other features of a good society are subordinate to our collective love of liberty. The first stanza of the Star-Spangled Banner ends with a rousing declaration that we live in the land of the free and the home of the brave. And the New Hampshire state motto puts the American imperative succinctly: live free or die. It is with this fact about the superordinate role of freedom in mind that I want to turn to the recently deceased Pope Benedict. The former theology professor provides rich resources for reflection. His astute summaries of philosophical and theological trends are matched by penetrating observations of our contemporary, increasingly post-Christian society. Nowhere is this combination more evident than in his discussion of freedom in a series of essays written in the 1980s. At that time, still young, or at least middle-aged, Joseph Ratzinger recognized that the West was suffering from a crisis of freedom. He was very far-seeing, I think, in the immediate aftermath of the 1960s to see that while everybody was crying about, screaming freedom in the streets, we were actually facing a crisis of freedom. And he saw that the ideal of individual freedom has become self-destructive. Pursuing it, building a world to promote it, quite literally makes us less free, even to the point of enslavement, either to our own weaknesses or to what Max Weber called the iron cage that monitors and controls us through impersonal bureaucracies and procedures. So today I want to exposit and elaborate upon Ratzinger's analysis. For our supposedly free society has slid into bondage, and we need to think about how to restore our precious American culture of freedom. So that's my agenda for this morning. So in a 1981 essay, Freedom and Constraint in the Church, Ratzinger notes a paradox in modern societies. It's the paradox of freedom. On the one hand, and this is him speaking here, quote, man has rid himself to a great extent of the ties of custom and tradition, end quote. In other words, once powerful authorities, some sacred, some educational, some moral, have been critiqued and disenchanted. Old constraints and prohibitions no longer hold sway. Moreover, technology has given us remarkable new powers. I can fly off to Rome, where I can chat with a friend in Tokyo on Zoom. And it seems that we now enjoy a great deal more freedom than those who lived in ages past. It's easy to think, well, aren't we much freer now than we were in past decades, past centuries? And yet, on the other hand, we're enmeshed in a vast network of rules and regulations. This is what Ratzinger notes this. I mean, I could observe that men of my grandfather's generation could build houses and open businesses without much in the way of paperwork. Today, there's very little of significance in life that is not cocooned in minutely detailed ordinances. This invasion of law's restrictive power concerns more than economic life. At the time of my birth in 1959, informal custom and tradition guided and constrained family life, but little existed in the way of legal and bureaucratic intervention. By contrast, today, family law is expansive and complex, so much so that lawyers now specialize in this area. It didn't exist in 1959, this notion of family law. New bureaucracies such as Child Protective Services have been erected. All of this is to say that in crucial areas of life, and there could hardly be a more important aspect of our private lives than how we raise our children, that in these crucial areas, we have gone from freedom to constraint and not the other way around. At the same time, the technology that extends our capacities also empowers those who wish to exercise social control. To a degree unprecedented in human history, governments and corporations can subject us to comprehensive surveillance. They know where I am and what I'm talking about. As we experienced during the pandemic, the possibility of participating in society can be regulated through biometric passports and other means that are not all that different from the social credit score method of social control adopted by the Chinese Communist Party. Now, I don't want to suggest that residents of Omaha, Nebraska suffer from the same constraints as those living in Wuhan, China. But we cannot disagree when Ratzinger observes that, given the developments in recent decades, quote, one may have doubts about whether the modern history of freedom has really produced an appreciable increase in freedom, end quote. Now, by my reckoning here, Ratzinger is too generous. Instead of doubts, I increasingly harbor the conviction that we are seeing an appreciable decrease in freedom in our society. So I want to delve into that. This decrease in freedom, I submit, stems from something deeper than an increase in regulation and an expansion of technological means of social control, however constraining they may be on our freedom. So let's think about it this way. Let's take a popular way to define freedom. It's the ability to do what you want as long as you don't harm others. It's kind of conventional. John Stuart Mill in his book on liberty. Freedom is the ability to do what you want as long as you don't harm others. Now, even by this libertarian standard, I submit that trends seem to be negative. That is to say, people cannot increasingly not do what they want. Consider divorce. Data indicate that at the time of matrimony, nearly everyone desires lifelong union. Yet half of first marriages end in divorce, and divorce occurs at an even higher rate in second marriages. In other words, when it comes to lifelong marriage, a very important aspiration for a supermajority of people, we now live in a society in which a striking number of people can't get what they want. They cannot achieve what they want. They want lifelong marriage. They cannot attain lifelong marriage. Or consider drug overdose deaths. When I was young, there was talk of a heroin crisis. In the 1970s, 7,000 people were dying each year of overdose. Today, that number exceeds 100,000. I defy you to tell me that these people wanted to die. Again, we seem to be seeing a decline in freedom. In this case, a radical decline in the ability of some, 100,000 is not an insignificant number, a radical decline in the ability of some to get what is surely the most fundamental human want of them all, which is to stay alive. I can imagine someone interrupting here to say that disordered and undisciplined people tend to get divorced, take drugs, and engage in other self-destructive behaviors. True, nobody wants to swerve off the road and crash, but when it happens, it's their fault. Divorce, overdoses, and other so-called deaths of despair are signs, this argument goes, are signs of freedom misused, not lack of freedom. In my estimation, this reply indicates that the libertarian definition of freedom is inadequate. But let's hold off on addressing this defect and turn to the disciplined people in contemporary America, the winners, as it were, because they, too, seem to lack freedom. Truth be told, those at the top end of American society are often in the grip of powerful fears. As they run through the meritocratic gauntlet to gain the right credentials and honors and internships, the most talented people I meet are terrified of taking a wrong step. They worry inordinately about getting a bad grade, or, God forbid, saying something on social media that will cause them to be canceled. And it's not just academically successful people who seem fear-driven. Gen X high achievers spend hours in the gym concerned about their appearances. Baby boomers my age are locked in a desperate struggle not to get older. And in what possible world are gated communities and private security guards, largely unknown in my childhood, signs of freedom? As I've written recently, were my grandfather to survey the current scene, he would be shocked, not by the purported hedonism of our elites, but by the iron discipline and self-deprivation. Far from a culture of freedom, anything remotely carefree or adventuresome seem impossibly remote for those who aim for success. And polling data suggests that even among the young, even sex is in decline. Kind of that pretty primitive want there that doesn't seem to be, we don't seem to have the freedom to satisfy. Now, our bondages are many and various. The first letter of John features an evocative series of 3 phrases. The first is lust of the flesh. This best describes the disorder and dysfunction that shipwreck so many. The second is lust of the eyes. In biblical terms, this means idolatry, for idols transfix our gazes. Here, perhaps, we see career-oriented youth and wealth-fixated elites, and those who will do anything to serve health and beauty. The third and final phrase is pride of life, which aspires to evade mortality and thus nourishes paralyzing feelings of fragility and fear. And these feelings are very strong right now. Young people at fancy universities insist that they're vulnerable and easily hurt, and colleges respond by promising to provide so-called safe spaces. When Trump was elected in 2016, people wept openly. We regularly hear about the end of the world, climate catastrophe, or some other disaster is said to be looming. Our politics now runs on fear. Liberals announced the return of Hitler and Jim Crow 2.0. Conservatives warn that socialism is imminent, or that global oligarchs are about to impose the Great Reset. And of course, our response to the recent pandemic was powered by a deep sense of fear. That fear was so paralyzing that as Americans, we collectively cheered dire restrictions on our lives, restrictions that I think Giorgio Agamben is correct to observe made us lower than barbarians because we did not discharge the fundamental human duty of accompanying the dying and burying the dead. Say what you want about America in the 21st century. These are not qualities of a free society. As Thomas Hobbes observed, fear is the great and primordial enemy of freedom. Although less immediately damaging than fear, cynicism also undermines freedom. Today, students at fancy universities can throw themselves into the latest woke causes, dye their hair purple, call themselves non-binary, and in other ways fashion themselves as countercultural, and then, in their senior years, apply for McKinsey consultantships and other positions that are the very definition of conventional success. How do they reconcile this and other contradictions? One can think of Representative Ocasio-Cortez's self-proclaimed radical witness and her appearance at the super elite Metropolitan Museum of Art Gala in a very expensive dress. Like I said, I'm just flummoxed by this. Do young people not really believe their progressive rhetoric? Are they only pretending to be conventionally ambitious? I can't answer these questions, removed as I am as a baby boomer from the lives of people in their early 20s. But I do know that they bespeak a society in which it is very difficult to live in freedom. I could go on with examples. You could think that if people thought that the system was fundamentally corrupt in 1969, they went to live in some commune in Vermont. And then they realized that that wasn't going to work either, and then they went to law school and became corporate lawyers in New York City. Okay, fine, but there's a sort of way in which there's a kind of, you try to live the way that you believe you should, and they took the venture. And it was an experiment, and for most, the experiment indicated to them that the conventional was not as bad as they had thought. Be that as it may. But I could go on, but I won't go on with examples. Instead, allow me to put my analysis in summary form. In my lifetime, American society has been transformed. Although my generation grew up under the shadow of nuclear holocaust, today we seem to be afflicted by a far greater fear of catastrophe and death. I was at an event at a fancy university, and this young woman asked me what my views on climate change were, and I said, I don't really have any views. I don't really think about climate change. The whole group of these students was flabbergasted. It's such an immediate threat. And then I said, we did these drills where you go underneath your desks in your elementary school in the event of a nuclear attack. And then we went out and played. And our parents still had children, and we still went on with life. But for them, there seems to be this looming disaster that affects them and seems to paralyze them, make them unable to live their lives. And while my grandparents married and had children in the depths of the Great Depression, Today, young people seem to find marriage too risky and children too expensive. I went to high school in the final years of the old 1950s middle class consensus. And this consensus was often punitive to those who were awkward, odd, and deviant. But from what I observed, the anxiety my peers had that they might be excluded or judged pales in comparison to the fear high school students now have of being shamed on social media. One sign is that this incredibly high percent of high school students on medication for anxiety and things like that. And fear, as I've already noted, is the great enemy of freedom. So, an indictment of the contemporary society. We claim we're freer than we've ever been, but in actual fact, we're in all sorts of very profound bondages. So how has this happened? How has the land of the free and the home of the brave become a country of dysfunctional, anxious, and fearful people? To answer this question, I will return to Joseph Ratzinger. And he identifies two basic biblical concepts that help us understand the true nature of freedom: eleutheria and parrhesia. In our translations, the Greek word eleutheria is translated as free or freedom, as in the verse, "For freedom Christ has set us free." But as Ratzinger notes, this word does not mean freedom as unhindered choice and the capacity to do as one pleases. It's not the libertarian concept of freedom. Instead, in the ancient world, a free man differs from the slave in the fact that he has all the rights as well as duties of citizenship. So freedom turns on citizenship. And so it raises an interesting question for us as people living in the 21st century. Well, how does citizenship make a person free? Here's the way that Ratzinger sums up the concept of eleutheria. Quote, "It means the possession of full rights, full membership." And then he goes on to make a very interesting observation. It means being at home. The free man, this is him still speaking, the free man is one who is at home. That is, one who really belongs to the household. Freedom has to do with being given a home, end quote. Those really kind of arrested me. So freedom means being at home. At first glance, this definition seems perplexing. Isn't freedom found when we set out on our own, leaving home for new experiences, rather than being cozy in what is familiar? And I think what Ratzinger is identifying is the foundation for leaving home. If we're weak or frightened, we're very unlikely to embark on adventures. Freedom, in this sense, requires a firm, steady, reliable sense of self, which comes from belonging to something or someone or someplace. In the Christian tradition, the martyrs are the images of perfect freedom. Because they belong to Christ, which is the language that St. Paul uses, they are able to stand strong in their faith even against threats of torture and death. Now, Ratzinger goes on to expound this sense of freedom in Paul's famous allegory of Sarah and Hagar in the 4th chapter of Galatians. But I want to tarry and reflect on the close link between the ancient and biblical concept of freedom and the notion of being at home and belonging. Because in my reckoning, far from outdated, this view of freedom helps explain our collective loss of liberty. Now let's begin with some of my examples of our contemporary lack of freedom. We know that family breakdown makes life difficult. As social scientists put it, children growing up without a stable household often have, as they say, bad life outcomes. Studies show that children who grow up without a father in the home, especially boys, have a much higher incidences of antisocial and self-destructive behaviors. Thus, in a very literal sense, not having a home makes us susceptible to the lusts of the flesh that deprive us of freedom. It's not just family life that roots and grounds us. Society and culture function as a home. Here as well we see decay and instability. For my entire adult life, intellectuals and educators have emphasized the critical methods of deconstructing and debunking. A great deal of effort has gone into showing that what we once thought normal and worthy of our loyalty is in fact dangerously racist, patriarchal, and homophobic. Now, I don't want to litigate the 1619 Project, but whether you agree or disagree with its historical claims, you must allow that this initiative, and many others like it, erode our sense of being at home. After all, who wants to belong to a culture that is genetically unjust? And I could add, sort of Ralph Lauren is on the other side of that the commodification of home culture and heritage works in tandem with this kind of critical debunking. Now, many traditional societies have hearth gods, and these are the deities that oversee the household. Other gods function as patrons of the city, which in the ancient world means one's culture, that is to say, the norms and values that anchor our identities and give us a sense of who we are in relation to other ways of life in other cities. Now, one can reject polytheism, as I certainly do, and yet preserve the insight that powerful norms, such as lifelong marriage, have an enchanting power that sustains the household, even when the going gets tough. And the same holds for society and culture. Whether it's the Constitution or great books, we identify and honor touchstones that allow us to be at home. As that metaphor so clearly indicates, touchstones are what in the dark you can touch to know you're on your way back home. Progressives put up lawn signs declaring, "Hate has no home here." Now, I certainly appreciate the sentiment, but in truth, the progressive cultural agenda has been to reject the household-sustaining norms of traditional morality. And the same agenda problematizes, as they say, our cultural touchstones and insists that our inheritance is unworthy of our loyalty. As a consequence, all of us are less at home, and we increasingly feel as though we do not belong. And this, I submit, explains to a great degree the decrease of our freedom, not just among those who are shipwrecked by their vices, but also among the successful college students from Fairacres whose parents evoke progressive pieties. So, eleuteria, belonging, being at home, the erosion of home. And I think I could pursue that, if I had more time, also in an economic key and the way in which the market has invaded so many of our homes, whether it's community organizations, institutions. I think the university is, when administrators start to talk about customer satisfaction, you know you're in trouble. Now, the second word for freedom that attracts Ratzinger's attention is parrhesia. This Greek word concerns speech, and it can be translated as frankness or candor. The freedom it implies is simply the freedom to speak one's mind, that is to say what one wishes to say without hedging or in some way accommodating oneself to external pressures. Ratzinger turns to Paul's first letter to the Thessalonians in order to show how this concept functions, this kind of freedom functions. After an initial introduction in that letter, Paul tells us that he had a hard time in Philippi, but this did not lead him to trim his wings. He reminds the Thessalonians that when he and his comrade arrived, this is from Paul, quote, we had courage in our God to declare to you the gospel of God in the face of all opposition, end quote. Now, in this translation, courage is the word used to translate parrhesia, or a word that's derived from parrhesia. Now, Paul continues and emphasizes his trustworthiness as a witness. He does not speak with guile or engage in flattery in order to please men. He does not teach in order to gain money or acclaim. Paul seeks God's approval, he says, not worldly success. To use the language that I've developed here, Paul is in God's household, not as an alienated slave, but as an adopted son and heir. So he can resist temptations and face adversities because he belongs to God. Put in different terms, Paul is animated by love and loyalty. The freedom he possesses to speak with candor does not arise from self-loyalty. His project is to advance his Father in heaven's agenda. This commitment gives him a home, that is to say, a place to stand against adversity. Now, parrhesia figures even more prominently in the book of Acts. Chapters 4 and 5 of Acts, and it seems to me we were going through them fairly recently in the lectionary. Parrhesia, they figure very prominently in chapters 4 and 5, which recount Peter's collision with the religious authorities in Jerusalem, who are very annoyed that common men like Peter have the presumption to talk about theology in the streets. The high priests bring Peter and his friends in for a talking to. But instead of being cowed by these great personages, Peter is forthright and speaks his mind. And Scripture reports that the high priests, quote, saw the boldness, parrhesia, of Peter and John. Taken aback, the religious establishment warns these common men not to speak in public again about these high things that they should have no business talking about, or else. But the authorities don't get what they want. Immediately upon release, Peter and his friends pray, quote, Lord, look upon their threats and grant thy servants to speak thy word with all boldness, parrhesia. Their prayers are granted, and Peter preaches boldly again. And he is again arrested, only to be freed from prison by divine intervention. There's a kind of subtle interaction here between the interior freedom to be able to preach God's word and the literal freedom that the Holy Spirit gives us the freedom from fear to speak, to proclaim God's word, and the Holy Spirit also gives Peter and his literal freedom by opening the gates of the prison. It's kind of an allegory for this interior state. At this point, the authorities in Jerusalem really are at their wits' end. Asking Peter and his comrades to explain their willful refusal to obey the command to remain silent, they reply with words that stand as the most fundamental declaration of independence. These are great words from the New Testament. We must obey God rather than men. And as this episode in the Bible ends, the little band of followers of Christ remain true to their pledge. They are beaten and once again ordered to be silent, but to no avail, for they continue to preach and teach. They are free, not just with their words, but I would submit in every respect. Now, I want to respect the theological dimension of this story. Saints Paul, Peter, and the rest of the early Christian crew were brought into the household of God by divine grace. Their faith was supernatural, which means it was more solid and powerful than any of our earthly loves and loyalties. But the concept of parrhesia applies in a secular context as well. We too can enjoy freedom, but to do so we need eleuteria, which is to say, we need to belong and be at home. Put concretely, if we see ourselves as full members of our families and insist that we must obey our families' values and traditions and not those of the social media mob, then we have something of the freedom that Peter enjoyed. We might say that we are loyal to our country and not to pontificating celebrities. More strongly still, we could say we belong to truth and will not betray it. That's available as a natural loyalty, not the supernatural loyalty of faith, to belong to truth and not to betray it. And these kinds of belonging bring us a large degree of freedom, not just in what we say, parrhesia, but in how we conduct our lives. Now, many people believe that we can restore freedom by litigating for our rights. Doesn't the First Amendment, after all, protect the freedom of speech? Now, I'm all for vigorous defenses of our rights, But we are misguided if we think these measures will do much to restore the American culture of freedom. A few years ago, I met a very bright young man who was an undergraduate at a fancy university. Smart young people and learned professors. One would think that the circumstances would be ideal for open discussion. But this young man told me that the first thing he learned as a freshman was never to say what he was thinking. This is a condition of bondage that cannot be overcome by appeals to constitutional rights. We need to recognize that freedom rests in belonging and what I would call home-making. To use the language that I developed at length in a recent book, Return of the Strong Gods, freedom arises from love and loyalty, which means that we cannot renew freedom by talking about freedom in a loud voice. As Ratzinger observes, the paradox of the modern West rests in the fact that our zeal for liberation has brought us homelessness and thus diminished freedom. Modern man has been too quick to judge his inheritance. I think of René Descartes, an important figure that did a great deal to shape our ways of thinking in recent centuries. He urged us to demolish the old house of knowledge so that we could build anew, this time on rational principles. Others who followed him saw justice as more important than reason, and they sought the demolition of traditional political life. Or they prized individual feeling and self-expression, urging the demolition of constraining moral norms. The story of the making of the modern world is complex, but I would submit that there is a guiding motif, and it is one of demolition for the sake of a hoped-for reconstruction. Today, we continue in this project of demolition. Our society continues to imagine that we can build back better. At this late date, the work of demolition has reached the extreme of policing pronouns and relabeling bathrooms in the vain hope that we can destroy the reality of nature and reconstruct a world in which being a man or a woman is a matter of choice. The upshot, I guarantee you, will be a further decline in freedom. I'm not speaking about those bureaucratic apparatus and that hectors and monitors, the iron cage that Max Weber spoke about, though this iron cage certainly diminishes our liberties. Rather, I dread a future in which young people can't even be at home in their own bodies. This condition of radical homelessness will make it very difficult to attain any meaningful freedom. So, in conclusion, where do we go from here? Ratzinger became Pope Benedict, and during his pontificate, he spoke to the German National Parliament. And he used that occasion to give his thoughts on what he called the foundations of a free legal regime. He did not use the biblical terms I have surveyed, but his reasoning in that context remained the same. The authority of reality, which presses upon us as the demand of truth, provides the foundations for a free society, Ratzinger argued. Our society can sustain a culture of freedom only to the degree that we are at home in what is real, rather than in what we imagine or hope for, no matter how alluring our dreams may be, no matter how immaculate and just our imagined alternatives may seem. Benedict concludes with a summary statement very apt to our historical moment, a time when we imagine that we can fashion ourselves anew at any moment, whether it's transgenderism or transhumanism or some other vision of leaping over the limits of our bodies. So this is his statement. Quote, "Man is not merely self-creating freedom. Man does not create himself. He has intellect and will, but he is also nature, and his will is rightly ordered if he respects his nature, listens to it, and accepts himself for who he is, as one who did not create himself. In this way, and in no other, is true human freedom fulfilled." End quote. We do not and cannot create ourselves. We have mothers and fathers, although that's, in the next 20 years, that will be problematized with technology, I guarantee you. We are formed and shaped by a particular place and culture. Again, we are engaged in a project of becoming a kind of at least among elites, becoming purely cosmopolitan. Our lives are framed by inherited traditions, norms, and expectations. These restrict us, preventing us from becoming, in the snap of our fingers, whomever we wish. But that's the blessing, not a curse. For only by being at home within these defining loyalties, only by belonging can the promise of freedom be fulfilled. I think that's Ratzinger's insight. If we hope to renew the American culture of freedom, we must restore the authorities that limb and define our places of belonging. We must find noble traditions that evoke our gratitude and win our obedience. Our task is to restore the solidity to the places that bid us to take a stand. Only in loves and loyalties that win our hearts and bind our wills can we tell the world, no, I will not do your bidding. No, I will not allow you to silence my voice. And so as the modern age ends in freedom's betrayal, the paradox that Ratzinger identifies return, this time reversed. Going forward, we must find truths to obey so that we can be free. Thank you.
All right. Thank you for your attention to Dr. Reno's speech, and thank you, Dr. Reno, for the talk, which is very provocative and thought-inspiring. We will now move to the panel portion of our event and hear first from Omar Gutierrez.
Thank you, Carson. I was very glad to hear that both men have rejected the title scholar, which makes me feel much more at home and comfortable.
What is the only super eminent scholar?
Yeah, that's right. As one of you. So at first, thank you to Dr. Holloway and Dr. Reno for allowing me to be part of this and sharing my thoughts on Pope Benedict, Colonel Ratzinger, who I've been reading for many years, who I followed, who's shaped so much of my own theology and way of being a Christian. I was struck by a couple points in your presentation that connected with certainly my own experience. At one point you said, truth be told, those at the top of American society are often in the grip of a powerful fear. They are, quote, terrified of taking a wrong step. It reminded me of an essay you wrote for First Things years ago, where you were comparing by analogy the way older generations and younger generations view life in general. The older generation tends to view life as like a train on steel tracks, and that life has these certain stops on the way directed towards success or happiness, however that's defined for the individual. Sometimes it's the place in Vermont, sometimes it's the Upper East Side of Manhattan, but wherever that is, right, there's a certain number of stops, whereas younger generations view life as being in a sailboat in the middle of a lake, and you have the opportunity to go anywhere. But they're paralyzed because they're afraid of going in the wrong direction and not knowing if they're making a mistake. And I think that reality, that fear, is very much there. And that analogy you used has stuck with me ever since. So leaving aside the opioid crisis and deaths of despair, which you mentioned, which are its own phenomenon, the data compiled by the likes of Dr. Jonathan Haidt and others, tells us there is massive anxiety and depression plaguing our young people, separate from the opioid use. And the causes can be debated, but no one seems to doubt that there are serious problems of fear and depression, anxiety, hopelessness, cynicism, fragility, if you will, that make your statements about the politics of fear ring more than just true but prophetic. So as in the tradition of the old prophets, not just true, but as a warning to us all of what can and maybe already is happening. The second thing that you said struck me was your thoughts on the Acts of the Apostles and Peter's bold preaching, parousia. You do very well to tie this into the importance of home and the courage that can and does come from having a home, a place. Thus, the freedom so adamantly pursued by us in the West has resulted, as you say, in homelessness and a diminished freedom because it lacks a common home we can claim together. So with these two thoughts, then, I wanted to draw on something else from the same essay by Father Ratzinger that you reference, where he brings up these two Greek words about freedom, the essay titled Freedom Can Straighten the Church, to suss out something he points out in that essay, in which I see as well in our society, and which I think sometimes is a distraction or an obstacle to getting at real freedom. Writing about parousia, or courage boldness, he says, I'm quoting, the free courage of the free man presupposes above all freedom of itself, a state of being set free from oneself because he has committed himself to the word of the gospel. It thus becomes clear that freedom begins first in man's being. Freedom begins first in man's being in order then to take actual shape in the rights of freedom for action, unquote. Or in other words, authentic freedom is possible when one has a home, and in this case the gospel, which provides not just a place, but, and here's my point, an identity in being that precedes action. And this is an important point, I think, because there's a model within certain schools, certainly certain schools within Catholic social theology, social teaching, or Catholic political thought, if you will, that emphasize action, and which also argues for courage and boldness based on a version of the gospel that is meant to propel every Christian towards the remaking of society, where action is the first step. I call this the praxis model, after the Greek word for action, acting. This praxis model, very popular in some circles, argues that to win liberation, we must first engage in action. Reflection then is a second step, a reflection on the action, so that the discovery of truth is a third and often an elusive step that is further down the line and is ultimately subservient to action, because the point is always action. In his essay, Father Ratzinger gives the example of Father Ernesto Cardenal, the Nicaraguan priest who, after criticizing some of the more totalitarian aspects of the communist regime in Cuba, eventually, years later, repented of that criticism. He apologized for criticizing the Cuban regime, which had persecuted so many, so that Father Cardenal sublimated his own identity as a priest, his own identity as a defender of human rights, for the sake of the work, the action of liberation in Cuba. He abandoned his own identity for the sake of the cause, Ratzinger points out in the essay. So I bring this up because in my experience, this approach to politics by the praxis model necessarily pits citizens of earth and heaven against each other. Once everything becomes a matter of fidelity to the cause, the action, there must by necessity be an us and a them. It is an oppositionist approach which praises courage or parousia, but a version of parousia or of courage that only serves the cause. And this, too, is a trend I see in our own political speech. Because of the politics of fear, which you so rightly point out, we have mistaken boldness for truth. We've confused anger for righteousness. We assume that the loudest, most obnoxious voices on our side are the best voices because they get things done, because they own the other side. If you spend any time on YouTube or social media, you've seen, right, the headlines, right? So-and-so destroys the other side, right? Mm-hmm. These are the titles of the videos, right? They're meant to get you to click. So it is then that Father Ratzinger writes, again quoting from the essay, the idea of freedom is here pushed to its ultimate radical position. No longer merely emancipation from tradition and authority, but emancipation from the idea of the creation of man. Emancipation from his or her own nature and essence, a state of complete indeterminacy which is open to anything. But it is precisely this freedom, still quoting Ratzinger, it is precisely this freedom that seems at the same time to be hell. To be free means to be damned. So the radical idea of freedom turns into party loyalty, which takes the place of the lost idea of human nature and is meant to give man footing and direction, unquote. I think a lot of that is very prophetic. I would argue that part of Pope Benedict's enduring wisdom was his insistence that the liberation for which we seek is a liberation that must start not in action, but in being, in ourselves, in human nature, in our identity. It must start with a kind of self-possession that is rooted in an identity that transcends party loyalty and that ultimately transcends this earth, but which does not ignore this earth. One of the most consistent themes in Pope Benedict's writings, and one which encapsulates so much of what inspired the Second Vatican Council, at which he was an advisor, in which he was a very dominant voice, is his call to communion, the call to communion. Communion, he writes again and again in many different works, communion starts from within, from identity. Communion is a fruit of a life lived specifically in relation to those around us and is made possible by, not action, but by identity in things outside of us. Other cultural commentators have noted that it's used to be the case that when people ask you who you are, we used to say first, I'm a father, a mother, a daughter, a brother, a friend, a part of this city, this community. The point being that our identities are defined by our relationships first, by our loves, as you say. And this is the fruit of what Pope St. John Paul II and Pope Benedict XVI called the logic of gift, which is part of love. And in Pope Benedict's encyclicals, his authoritative writings as Pope, they all included a section or were entirely about the social teaching of the Church, this political approach to reality, to the Church's teaching. And that teaching, per one of our previous popes, is founded on four values: truth, freedom, justice, and love. But according to all those teachings, right, truth has to exist. Because without it, there can be no freedom. Julia Galef, who's a commentator and a thinker, wrote a book a number of years ago called The Scout Mindset, which I found helpful in attempting to try to undo or denude this oppositionist thinking. And in her analogy, she speaks of what a soldier does. Whenever we're encountered with an idea that we disagree with, a soldier kicks in and he defends the position, and because a soldier's job is to win at any cost. And you may be like me, for your sake I hope you're not, but you may be like me in that I've too many times in my life engaged in bad arguments to defend an idea I wanted because I was part of that soldier mindset. Whereas a scout, however, goes out with a very specific job to discover the truth of things as they are, to see the reality even of the enemy's position so that they can mount a better argument, a better attack, a better defense, but they live in the truth. I like the analogy because it doesn't pretend that we don't have sides, right? It doesn't pretend that there isn't right and wrong or truth and falsehood. But it suggests that as we attempt to overcome this oppositionist tendency in our society, that we do so first and foremost by seeking out truth. And I'll end here with just a couple of observations. C.S. Lewis, in writing about friendship, says that we become friends where two or more can point to some truth or beauty or goodness outside of themselves and revel together in that truth or beauty or goodness. To be educated then towards those things is to create the seedbed of friendship, and so can create an education for freedom which fulfills an authentic, prophetic boldness for the good of all. And in order that we might draw more of us into a common home then, marked by friendship, love, which fulfills justice, I agree wholeheartedly that in the end, we do not and cannot create ourselves. We have mothers and fathers. We are formed and shaped by a particular place and culture, to use your words. And I think Pope Benedict would encourage us to look at the truth of our own love and loyalties that win our hearts and bind our wills, so that we can tell the world not just no, which is important, but also, yes, my friend, yes. Look at our home, our communion, rooted in the truth of our identities as human beings. Thank you.
All right, I want to thank our guest lecturer for his insightful account of Pope Benedict's thought and his provocative application of it, to some important contemporary questions, especially the status of freedom in modern societies that want to be free, that value freedom highly, but that also seem to be worried about various kinds of erosions of freedom. I also take a moment here to remark that the Constitutional Studies Forum is dedicated not only to reflection on the United States Constitution and its various interpretations, but also the philosophic and moral foundations of constitutional order. So even though Dr. Reno did mention the First Amendment, the broader questions are also very much on point. Secondly, I'd like to say just a few words about Pope Benedict as a thinker and his relevance or possible relevance to our own concerns. An obvious objection to looking at his thought in relation to contemporary problems would go like this. You can't learn anything about contemporary problems from studying Pope Benedict because he's a reactionary man whose mind really belonged to the past. One would think that if your view of him was shaped entirely by the presentation of him in the media, it's a rigid, dogmatic, narrow-minded, authoritarian mind. But if you actually read him, as Dr. Reno has done, and as Mr. Gutierrez has done, you encounter, and as I have done, a very different kind of person. It's a person, Benedict is, to be sure, an absolutely Orthodox Catholic, but you also encounter vast learning, not only about theology, but about philosophy, history, politics, and literature. You encounter moderation, sobriety, gentleness, openness to non-Catholic and even non-Christian points of view. He's definitely interested in the dialogue between Catholicism and the modern world and what good might come of it. Now, let me try to say something about the theme that Dr. Reno has propounded for us, freedom, fear, and belonging. So that argument implies, I think, that the kind of freedom that we want might depend upon Christianity, on the kind of belonging and safety that Christianity brings for believers. It's a complicated question, but I think there's one obvious thing that one could say in defense of that idea, and it's just this. One could say that the modern free societies, that is the democracies of the so-called advanced and progressive societies, started out in Europe and America. That is, countries that have been influenced by Christianity for a very long time. So it's very reasonable to wonder whether this kind of modern society could have emerged without Christianity and whether they can maintain their character without Christianity, although they seem determined to try to do that. But the question's complicated because these modern societies also emerged in some ways in opposition to Christianity or to traditional Christianity. These societies are products of the Enlightenment and its quest for a rational and free society. The Enlightenment emerged, again, in these Christian countries, European countries, but in some ways it obviously wanted to get away from Christianity. And we can see this if we think a little bit about this problem of fear. The Enlightenment can be understood as a philosophical and political effort to free people from various fears that had enslaved them. Most obviously, it wanted, through the progress of reason and science, to free people from superstitious fears that its proponents thought went with traditional Christianity. People won't have to fear hellfire and the wrath of God anymore if they live in a reasonable and enlightened society. In addition, it wanted to free people from the fear of death, or at least from fear of early death. Through the progress of science and reason, we can defeat disease and repair injuries, and maybe even conquer death itself through the progress of medicine. This is a very well-known, popular, and powerful Enlightenment narrative. Things get better and better because reason and science replace religion. But Pope Benedict's thought, I think, helps us to see that the truth is not so simple as that narrative suggests. In his sermons on creation, which are compiled into a little book called In the Beginning, which is a very valuable book, I think, he notes that biblical revelation is itself a kind of enlightenment. People in the ancient pre-biblical world tended to believe that the world is full of mysterious, unintelligible powers. But it's the Bible that comes along and says the world's intelligible because it's the result of a supreme intelligence, a supreme wisdom. Obviously, death is fearful in a world full of mysterious, clashing powers, like the Olympian gods or the gods that the Norse believed in. But one need not be afraid of death if there's a God who wills that each person should exist. The issue gets even more complicated when we recognize that the modern Enlightenment societies have not succeeded so decisively as they like to think, as Dr. Reno suggests. Again, they've dedicated vast resources to overcoming fear of death, but it turns out that we're more afraid of death than ever. This may be the result of some philosophical mistake, or it may just be the result of necessity. It makes sense that people who live in dangerous societies, who face death all the time, develop a certain fortitude in the face of death. And it makes sense that people who've been made very safe for a very long time will be fearful when it looks like their safety might be threatened. We're soft compared to people who lived in earlier times. But in any case, the modern quest to conquer fear of death seems like it's not succeeded the way modern societies had hoped it would. And I think this is also true when we think about the other fear that Dr. Reno mentions, which is also supposed to be addressed by modern enlightened societies. I mean, fear of exclusion. We seek belonging and we fear exclusion. The Enlightenment solution was to establish societies that are based on what all human beings have in common. They're based on human nature, instead of more partial identities like religion or ethnicity. So in such a society, everybody belongs, nobody suffers the pain of exclusion. But it turns out, as we've been reminded, that even in modern societies that are based on this principle, there are still differences of opinion and differences of power that create very real fears of exclusion, ostracism, and disgrace. So again, it's very far from clear that the fundamental problem has been solved by our enlightened societies. Probably Pope Benedict would suggest that Christianity is the more reliable solution to these fears. Science can cure a lot of things, but not death. If you really want to not be afraid of death, it helps to believe in a loving creator. And modern freedom can provide a lot of protection. Constitutional order can provide a lot of protection, but it can't eliminate the possibility of undeserved disgrace, exclusion, and ostracism. So if you really want to not fear cancellation, it helps to believe that God is real and his judgment is the one that really counts. And that kind of freedom from fear is necessary to a good democracy, which requires individuals who have the courage and the serenity to tell the majority, you might be wrong. You are wrong. Well, I'm not going to pretend that these half-baked observations of mine show that Pope Benedict has the surefire solution to what ails modern societies, but I think they're enough to say that modern societies, modern enlightened societies, are not as self-sufficient as they like to think that they are. And therefore, I think they ought to be willing to listen to friendly critics like Pope Benedict, who are coming at the modern world from the outside, so to speak. Thank you. Okay, thanks for your attention. We have time for questions now from the audience to the panel. Oh, I'm sorry, that's right. Would you like to respond to our thoughts?
Just very briefly, I think the very nice pairing, Omar, you spoke about boldness born of anger, and Carson, your observation that our fears seem to be paradoxically intensified. It's, objectively better conditions, spiritually worse conditions, maybe is the way I would put it. People live longer and they fear death more. Our society, is far less, rigidly divided according to these preset categories, but people fear even more not belonging or being excluded. And so it could be maybe that, the anger rises, and we also notice we live in a society where a lot of our politics is driven by anger, is that people sense that anger is a foundation for freedom of a sort. As you point out, Omar, I think it's very perceptive that parrhesia that comes out of anger, I'm not going to take it anymore, stick it to the man, or whatever it might be. They seem to work together. The anger as a kind of desperate attempt to find something that will fuel in our souls, the thumos that will let us stand up to things. And I think that for me, in the work I've done in the last few years, I've become more and more enamored of Platonism, more sympathetic to Platonism, and that the boldness born of anger is very different from the boldness born of love, it seems to me. And I would add, too, this praxis model. Certainly, it is not a progressive only model. It is nearly universal. So the Francis Bacon, scientific transformation of everything is sort of utterly congenial to, people who are on the so-called right, often taking the form of, economic market transformations of all traditional institutions. And we see this with the invasion of social media into every minute of our lives. So we're 24/7 consumers now, and content providers all at once. That's a very much a Baconian. We're well along in the metaverse in that sense, where we don't live our lives. Every aspect of our life is raw material for to be transformed, not to be understood or enjoyed or to have gratitude for.
Okay, great. Now we can have questions from the audience. Let's go back here first, then Father. Go ahead.
Thank you to all three speakers. I think the idea of belonging and the home is a powerful one. Also, the ideas of truth, the good, and beauty. So I think it's really, we need to understand why those ideas have lost their purchase in modern philosophy. I think we really need to explore, in my mind, the relationship between the kind of philosophy that has been cultivated in the modern period. Dr. Reno talked about Descartes, a lot of followers from that. But these things, you can't find a home in something that your philosophy tells you isn't there. And I would focus on the good for a moment. I think this is a very powerful idea that there are no goods. I think we really need to think about modern philosophy in connection with the capitalist economic order and a lot of the theories about it, so economics. So if you look at, it seems to me that the economics that is taught generally everywhere is based on the idea there are no goods.
Just values.
Just values or preferences.
Right.
Really, right? So what is the aim? What is the aim? If insofar as you want to talk about an aim at all, is preference satisfaction, but that's already built on the utter elimination of good. So and truth, we have so many varieties of skeptical theories. So it seems to me that what all this points to my mind, is to really try to understand the nexus of a lot of very powerful movements in modern thought, and I think the mainstream of economics and what's involved in, Dr. Reno's talked about the market in different ways, but what's involved in what sensibilities are produced. These things are very powerful parts of life. I think Pope Benedict was not reactionary. It's a conservative. So there were a couple of guys back in the mid-19th century who used the phrase to describe the world that was emerging before them as all that's solid melts into air, all that is holy is profane. And it seems to me like all of this discussion is really pointing to that.
Thank you.
I think the way I agree, those words from the Communist Manifesto were prophetic. It's evident now that everything. In fact, I think one of my reasons I'm optimistic about the church in the coming decade is that it's the only institution left that's not selling you anything. Everything holy has been profaned. And insofar as the church, with all of its flaws, doesn't actually sell something, it may be the last institution existing in the West that's not actually swallowed by the limited liability corporation as a model for how to conduct its own institutional life. So I think, but I agree. I think there's a difference between serving and wanting. And, the market economy is organized around wants, and it stimulates them and creates them, certainly. And it has a tendency to crowd out the things that we want to serve. Not my will, but thine. And that, again, there's a supernatural sense of that I think you ought not to try to import into civic life or family life. I mean, your family, however wonderful it is, does not have the loyalty you should ascribe to God, which is with all your heart and all your mind and all your soul. You should have some critical distance, as they say, and the same thing, even more so, for our polities, civic institutions, and political communities. But we have to nurture in people a kind of fitting sense of gratitude for the things, their homes, effectively, which we all have one way or the other. I mean, most of the emphasis in our time has been on those who have very good reason to want to leave home. I mean, their homes were abusive or mistreated them. And that's whether it's our national home for African Americans or literal homes for people from abusive parents and so on. We've reorganized way too much of our thinking around how to address that needed home leaving, if you will, and giving people the tools to leave home, both emotional and political. And we need to shift attention and say, well, we live in a time when our homes are threatening to be dissolved and melt, and we need to put more effort in both as pedagogues and as legislators and whatever vocation of life into the activities that would reinforce and renew this loyalty or love and loyalty is the terms I use.
I'll take a stab at this one as I understand it. I mean, I teach political philosophy, the history of political thought, and I usually teach the students that Thomas Hobbes is a pivotal figure in developing modern political philosophy, and it seems to me he does a couple of things that are relevant to our discussion and to the question that was raised. I mean, one is he does teach openly, back in the late 1500s, 1600s, that the human mind is really not capable of grasping the order of things. And so therefore, everything that is called good is really just a projection of people's passions. There's no objective good to be sought. There's just how we feel about it. And in politics, he says at one point, tyranny is just monarchy misliked. There's no such thing as tyranny in the real world. There's no moral distinctions in the real world, just your own passions about them. And then the other thing that's relevant to our discussion is that, and I haven't thought about this enough to give the full answer on this, but I'm going to just throw it out there because I think it's relevant, that Hobbes says that the fundamental reaction of human beings to their experience of existing is one of fear. Fear is the fundamental experience. Rather than say gratitude for the goodness of being. And I would relate that to something that was said by Dr. Reno by this observation. You made the point that Benedict says if we don't face reality, we can't really be free. But then you've got the problem of these more radical forms of modernity that say reality is bad and fearful, and it has to be rejected and overcome and then somehow reconstructed on the basis of praxis. On the basis of what principles? I don't know. Because if reality is bad, then anything you do is going to be necessarily a fully kind of untrammeled creative project that there's no way to predict how that would turn out. Father, you can ask a question.
Well, I know Benedict said this in exactly this way, and I'm sure nobody believed it, but that the Christian notion of freedom is not to do whatever you want, but to do what you ought in light of what's good. To defer to what is good and becoming truly free by doing it. But so it involves like some restraint, and really looking at like the construction of our government. I think they do like not only human nature, but follow human nature pretty well. They designed the system with so many checks and balances because they knew people would grab the power and hopefully try to tear the whole thing apart, which might be happening right now. I'm not sure, but just that sense of like in this day and age where we don't seem to really be able to handle civilly things like social media very well or phones, the power that's in them. In the face of when you hear rumblings of this, I think of Elon Musk as sort of like this interesting genius character, but sending up warning flags about artificial intelligence. Like what can, in light of that, which is so hard to restrain ourselves in like this ready technology that might be able to answer questions for us. Like what can the principles that Benedict upheld offer to people in the sense of like not going down that road in terms of deferring to that as another source of wisdom or intelligence. Because I think it's advancing on this pretty quickly, and you see people talking about it, but I don't think anybody really knows what to do with it. These are the real things that affect people. They're going to sources like this to seek wisdom, and like there's an offering of wisdom that's ancient being offered here. What's going to hold this up is sort of like an attractive alternative to these new powerful technologies that are far beyond what we even have right now. I guess. Thoughts around that?
Back to Patrick Murray's point, one has to have some conception of the things that are to be protected. And we don't, it's hard, we're not, it doesn't seem to me that we have an educational system, so if you go to university, you're trained in a technocratic reason that is utterly indifferent, or it just brackets the question of the good. And then you're also trained in recognizing injustice, but you're not trained in how to identify the things that are to be protected, the goods to be encouraged, or the goods to be defended. And so it's not, unless we can have some kind of preparation of the mind for that, it's very difficult to know, well, what are we protecting from the artificial intelligence? Maybe we're protecting jobs, well, in which case we have to have some sense of the good of labor as an intrinsic human good. And I don't think there's any consensus in our society about that, because we don't even have, Alistair McIntyre, after Virtue was 40 years ago, identified that we suffer from a kind of moral aphasia as a society about even formulating a moral language that can identify the good.
Yeah, the labor point was where I was going to go. My concerns with the AI and taking over industries, entire jobs, and that sort of thing. Pope Benedict, in writing the social teaching in one document, 2009, uses this phrase, gratuitousness, fostering the sense of gratitude as the foundation for an attitude that we can practice and engage in relationships that helps with interpersonal relationships, but also is good economics, he says. So in light of that, right, to be grateful of work and persons more than, let's say, simply profit margins would be, I think, part of his response to that. And it's also, just as a quick anecdote, because I just saw this yesterday, the story of a young man who was suffering through anxiety and various things, and through a friend was encouraged to start making yogurt as something just to occupy his time. And so he started doing that, and eventually one day as he sat in front of the yogurt, he just realized that he would pause just before he started eating. He was a man with no faith, whatever. He would pause, and then he realized his pausing was in gratitude for the yogurt. And then he realized, I didn't make the yogurt, right? The yogurt involved processes that I'm not in control of. And that's when he realized, okay, there's something beyond me that I can now dedicate my life to. And it started with that gratitude. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Narcotics Anonymous has started using the home group thing. I'm realizing that Narcotics Anonymous meeting is a home to some people that allows the freedom to make correct actions. It's a not what more people normally think of as home, but does that make sense to you that it's home for addicts?
What's it?
The Alcoholics Anonymous?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, no, just I met a gentleman alcoholic who'd been involved with AA for years, And that was the point he was making to me as I was meeting with him, is that's part of his home, that he can, in Omaha, at almost any time of the day, can find a group that he can go to when he needs. And that sense of belonging to that throughout his day, throughout his life, is what gives him a great deal of sense of himself and allows him then to be a better husband and a better father to his family.
Well, it's who do we belong to?
Yeah.
Who are our people? I think is an important question. I mean, one of the problems with a kind of Kantian universalism, which in one form or another is very much a powerful part of the way in which contemporary elites at least see their moral duties, is that it's the Mrs. Jellybean, is it Mrs. Jellybean, the Dickens character who stars her own children to be able to send money to people in Africa? There's a way in which you can sort of love humanity and be indifferent to your duties to your near neighbor. And I think that there a certain amount of that, that's a temptation. We recognize the problems of xenophobia and the dangers of a kind of narrow-minded loyalty to one's own, but in the effort to overcome that danger, we've undermined, especially among elites. I mean, what could be more convenient than to undergo critical pedagogy about, all the corrupt, the intrinsic racism of your country, et cetera, et cetera. It kind of liberates you then to pursue your own self-interest as a investment banker. I mean, why should I be loyal to America? I've been told all for 4 years. And so it kind of sets a person free to be a servant of humanity while liberating them from the actual duties and obligations of being part of a people. Mm-hmm. And I think it's true for family as well. Ties of family are strong. And one of the striking things is people come from very difficult family backgrounds, still make a huge amount of effort to get together and to preserve what can be preserved. Great testimony to how important that is in people's lives. But even there, I think it was the Daily Telegraph did an article. They have a femdom column. It's it's kind of women's thing. And the 32-year-old woman left her boyfriend. It's just his struggle with cancer was just really getting me down. And she went to Thailand to go to pursue her some yoga thing. And that was presented by the newspaper as, well, people need to give attention to self-care. So, even belonging at that intimate level is really dramatically eroded in our time, more so than I think people my age realize. Hence, again, fear. Like, why would I enter into these relationships? Right, yeah. They just can be dissolved in a blink of an eye.
Sequoia, go ahead.
Just thinking about fear, I was thinking about fear of government and fear of religion and how they're kind of necessary, and just thinking about how fear of the consequences for using heroin, the fear of consequences for drunk driving, or the fear of consequences for choosing the wrong major in college. Isn't fear sort of the guiding light for prudence? And also, that being said, freedom, criminality, being a criminal.
No, fear is not the guiding light for prudence. I mean, prudence would be, the taking into consideration the dangers of pursuing the good that one ought to pursue. So it's a positive end, not a negative one. Look, it's obviously wise to consider the perils facing one, but fear is ultimately a paralyzing emotion. It's a prohibiting emotion, not a permitting emotion, if you will. And it only makes sense to cultivate a proper sensitivity to the dangers in one's life path, if one actually has a life path. And you can only have a life path if you have some conception of what it is that you wish to honor, serve, attain, achieve.
Well, one could say that fear is part of a any healthy makeup, right? But that it presupposes good things that need to be protected, and the goods are more fundamental than the fear. Is that fair?
Mhm.
Okay. We have time for one more question. You had your hand up. Go ahead.
Your aim pointed out Benedict talking about how we connect the paradox of the freedom of the truths to obey, sort of Russelline Aquinas, or the freedom for excellence, that often later broke down the freedom for difference, at least really taking our lives to John Stuart Mill, and sort of the libertarian idea. Can you say a little bit about how that's kind of incarnate in the American project, not just sort of like, is it founding Protestant or Catholic, but how those things come together in that sense, and like, is there a sort of natural tendency due to our own history for one or the other that might be a limiting factor for how we can perhaps respond in a better way for the future to actually have those truths to obey that might make it more difficult for Americans to do that?
Well, I mean, clearly, liberalism in general is an attempt to moderate political life by bracketing questions about the highest good or aspects of the questions of the highest good. And obviously in our Constitution, it's the question about, which way of serving God is the correct way to serve God. So that always would impede, if you will, the ability of our culture to inculcate this sort of really, full bore, full spectrum freedom for excellence. And so the assumption, I think, in the founders is that would be that civil society inculcates that, and the government keeps itself at a distance from those kinds of questions. And whether there's a genetic inevitability to a kind of atrophying of any freedom for excellence, I don't know. I'm very skeptical of ideas. Do have consequences, but they're not dominoes that once one falls, they go. So I'm very skeptical of a kind of negative Hegelianism that you get in a lot of critics of modernity.
Yeah, and the only thing I would mention is it reminded me of Pope John Paul II, who was a philosopher and an ethicist first, who talks about, especially with this, the freedom for indifference, the modern understanding of freedom in fides et ratio to leading to two kinds of ultimately self-destruction, right? So if we can present, I think, because we're afraid of death, right? If we can present that this freedom of indifference, which is so dominant, leads to self-destruction. If we can make that case, I think we can begin to change people's minds away from that to the proper understanding of freedom.
But back to your question, because I think there's in my talk, I identified Descartes partly because he uses the house of knowledge image, the metaphor of a house, and it fits so nicely with Benedict's observations about home. There's a tendency, given how disordered our society is, I mean, perhaps it has always been disordered in many respects, but we feel pretty acutely how disordered our society has become. It's tempting to think that we'll have a kind of conservative version of Descartes, and we'll knock down this house of the Constitution or this house of that the founders built, and we'll build it better. We'll build it anew. I think that's a temptation I would like to avoid. One has to engage politically with respect to the world in which one's in, and try to make things a little better, or even maybe just prevent things from getting worse, and work with the materials that we have, the stones, the lumber that we actually have, rather than saying, if we just get rid of this, we can build back better with the right sort of, Thomistic materials or Aristotelian materials or what have you, instead of these defective, debased Lockean building materials that the founders were using, along with all kinds of other things. Their kind of deistic Christianity and so on. So I guess my counsel is, avoid a kind of revolutionary sentiment. There.
All right. Thank you all for coming. Thanks to our panel.
Thanks.